tonight. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to chat with you all. This is a session that I love to talk about, not only in Delta Sig world, but I use it quite a bit in my professional world. And so I think I'll have plenty of examples to share with all of you. Please, again, this is way more engaging and interesting if we're sharing conversations. So don't hesitate to ask questions as I go along. I'll probably ask some questions along the way of you, and please don't hesitate to jump in from that perspective. Also, if I hit on something and you've got a follow-up question, feel free to throw that in the chat. Love to share and make sure that everything that I'm talking about today really resonates with you and you're able to take it back and give it really practical application. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. First of all, I'll give you a little bit about background on me and what I do and why I can talk to you about this idea of developing trust to build strong teams. I am actually a Delta Sig alumni from Eastern Illinois University, and I graduated way too many years ago, but I have been a volunteer leader ever since the time that I graduated, and I've served on a variety of different roles across the organization. I was National Professional Development Chair for several years. I was also a trustee for 6 years and served as chair of the foundation for 3 of those 6 years. So I have a ton of Delta Sig experience and look forward to sharing that with you. One of the pieces, this presentation actually came from some board development work that we did at the national level several years ago, where we really set out, it was a new board, lots of folks that had worked together before and needed to quickly come together and develop trust and figure out how to work as well as an organization. And so we actually used a lot of these experiences and concepts during that process and thus turned it into something that you all can use at the chapter level. In addition to my Delta Sig experience in my professional life, I actually am the owner of an HR consulting firm. I started my own consulting firm about 5 years ago after spending most of my career in corporate HR, doing HR, human resources, recruiting, and leadership development. And then now my consulting firm specializes in bringing, in addition to doing HR services and recruiting services for small to mid-sized clients, we also do quite a bit of leadership development for our clients. And so some of this work and some of the examples that I will share with you today will be Delta Sig related, but all of this translates really easily into your world as a leader in the business profession. And so want to make sure that you are able to really kind of understand how to bring this together overall, regardless of the team that you're working on. And so I'll try to share real experiences, both from Delta Sig and from clients as we go through this today. This is probably one of my favorite quotes. It's this concept that teamwork is not a virtue. It's a choice and it's a strategic one. And as I've worked with organizations over the years, what's really interesting is some teams don't actually make the choice to build a team and to work together as a team. And it starts to show because sooner or later, the behaviors that manifest themselves keep them from being particularly impactful. I had a client just a couple of weeks ago that we actually took through some of this trust work as part of their leadership meeting. And many of these individuals had actually worked together for 10, 15, even 20 years. And their senior leadership team had really just in the last couple of years even started to think of themselves as a leadership team versus a group of leaders. And what was interesting was one of the very first conversations that we had is, are you a team? That seems like a really obvious answer, and yet it wasn't, because they had not made the strategic choice to put that leadership team first and act as though they were a first team. And these concepts are really well outlined in a book by Patrick Lencioni called The Advantage. It's also, there's a similar concept comes out of his book of 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and we'll talk quite a bit about all of those. And this entire concept of what is trust is largely based on the work of Lencioni. So if you haven't had the opportunity to read either of these 2 books, I put them on the must-see and must-read of your leadership development work, because they apply over and over and over again, and they're really critical to the types of things that you need to know to build teams. So there's a couple of things that we're going to talk about tonight. First of all, we're going to start with the 5 key behaviors that really create effective teams. We're going to dive pretty deep into these 5 behaviors, and particularly this core one, which is trust. I'm also going to share examples of how trust changes team dynamics So we'll get some live examples for you that you all will participate in as exercises. And then most importantly, I'm going to make sure you walk out of here with team activities that you can do either with your executive team or even broader with your chapters as a whole. And if you're already in the professional world, things that you can do in the work environment as well that really allow you to develop this level of trust with individuals, which allows you to accomplish the results that you're hoping to from a team perspective. So the first question is really, are you a team? Like I said, really seems super easy, but is this your team? If you picture your chapter, are you a group of individuals that are rowing together in a simultaneous manner to get to the results? And it's kind of smooth sailing. Or do you leave chapter meetings or exec board meetings feeling like, wow, we narrowly escaped the sense that we might just attack each other? It's really important to step back and really assess, where are you today? And more importantly, where do you want your team to be as you go forward? Some more thoughts of, are these some of the things that you sometimes hear from your team? No one cares about my opinion anyway. Why even bother? Blaming people, it's your fault. He did that on purpose to make me look bad. Or, I know it's a bad idea, but I'm not going to bother tell anybody. I'm too afraid to share my opinions because I might get shot down. These are signs that you have dysfunction within the team. These are signs that some of the key functions, particularly trust, are missing. And when our team is missing trust, it keeps us from being able to move up the organizational functions to really get to the best results. Now, each of these 5 areas are super critical to making sure you have teams working in a high level of functionality. Trust is at the foundation of this. When we trust one another, we're able then to engage in healthy conflict. Now, some of you may be going, oh my God, there is no conflict can be good conflict. The reality is, when we trust each other, conflict can be really positive. If you think about that person that you've probably had in your chapter, that good friend, you've got their back, that they'll be honest with you, you can be honest with them. And you've gone to them and said, I'm struggling with this. Or maybe you've gone, I got this great idea. And they were nice enough to say, ooh, that idea has some problems. But you knew that they were coming from such a great place that you were willing to hash out that conversation and learn from it and figure out what is the right best outcome. When you have trust, we now have conflict that doesn't feel like conflict. Instead, it feels like, oh, we were just all rowing in the same direction and we were collaborating. And that's really critical. Now, this kind of trust is not the kind of trust that is, Alexis says A, so Kayla's going to do B. This kind of trust really comes from the concept that I so trust that we are moving in the same direction. We are all trying to work as one team, that I am willing to be vulnerable. I'm willing to be vulnerable and put myself out there because I know at the end of the day, my team members will have my back. My team members will redirect me if I seem to be off course. Or if I've made a mistake, they'll tell me I've made a mistake, but they'll do it in a way that builds up the team, not derails the team. This is a kind of trust that allows us to get so close to that edge where we really feel like, yikes, I wonder where this conversation is going, only to find that that's when the real collaboration happens and when real differences take place for the organization. When we have that, now we can engage in healthy conflict. And now when people leave a meeting, you have real commitment to the organization and the ideas that are going forward. When you're willing to engage in healthy conflict, everybody leaves the meeting, even if maybe they didn't see eye to eye on the final outcome. But once the decision was made, they're willing to move forward and they're willing to be on board and be a champion for the moves that you've agreed to. Instead of walking out of the meeting and saying, yeah, I know we agreed to that, but I think it's a bad idea, so I'm not going to do my part. I'm not going to participate because I disagree with the decision that was made. When we get to that level of commitment, one of the things that starts to happen, and this is key because if we don't do this piece, all of the trust starts to go away again, is we start to hold one another accountable. We start to hold each other accountable for, did we all do the things that we said we would do? We nudge each other nicely when we say, you know, you were supposed to deliver that yesterday and we don't have it. What now? Or when we do leave a meeting perhaps and say, you know, I really still disagree with that idea. We help each other through and understand that I know you didn't agree, but how can I help you get on board? And finally, when we do all of these things, we start to get results in a very different way. In fact, we will exceed any other set of results that a team can reach, because at every phase we're going back and we're double checking ourselves and we're holding ourselves to our commitments and we're holding each other to that level of, you know what, it's okay to say, I think we've gotten derailed. And when we do that, we're more likely to hold ourselves accountable, but we're also more likely to help each other out. These concepts of the 5 dysfunctions are really important to overall teamwork, but I have to tell you, there's a reason that trust is at the bottom. Because if you don't first have trust, all of the other pieces start to break away. I want you to think about this for just a moment and picture a meeting in which somebody that you really trust in the organization, somebody that you've got, you know, a good friend of yours, you're sitting in a chapter meeting and they get mad. They get really mad. They get vein popping in the neck mad, face turning red mad. They slam their hands down on the table. They walk out the door and they slam the door on their way out. Well, when it's somebody that you really trust, we tend to stop and ask ourselves, I wonder what's the matter? Is that person okay? Did I do something wrong? When we trust somebody and they behave in a way that is out, we assume that that is out of character, in which case we start to go, oh no, what did I do? On the flip side, if somebody you've never met before is in a meeting for the first time and they get mad and the veins start to bulge and the face starts to turn red and they go run out, they slam their hands on the desk and they go out the door and they slam the door on the way out. Well, now, because we don't know them, we lead with, what a jerk. What's their problem? That was out of line. So it's interesting how when trust exists, we lead with, did I contribute to this situation? As opposed to when we don't have trust, we quickly jump to the conclusion, there must be something wrong with the other person. Key piece is that at the end of the day, when we trust people, we lead with an assumption of good intent. And this assumption of good intent is critical to how teams work. More importantly, it's critical how you run your life. I will tell you, I have met folks before who really struggle with trust, and we all trust at different paces. And some of us get to lead with trust, and we start with trust, and it's really hard to break our trust. These are the folks that, like my husband always tells me, are likely to get stolen off the face of the earth on any given day, because you could tell us anything and we're going to follow. On the flip side, other folks, you have to put a lot of deposits in their piggy bank in order to get them to trust you. We assume everybody trusts the same way we do, but that's not actually true. But the difference is when we lead with an assumption of good intent, we start to tell ourselves stories in our head that frame what's actually happened. I had a client last week that two of the managers actually saw a third manager take something that would have been considered theft. It's in a retail environment. It would have been considered theft. And they called me as their HR director and they're like, Katie, what do we do? And I said, well, tell me why you think this person stole something. What did you see? And they walked me through what they saw. And I said, okay, so take one step back. Is there a version of this story, if you rewrite it with an assumption of good intent, is there a version of this that makes sense? And they were able to think it through. They're like, well, it could have been this. And so then we went back through and said, okay, how do we get to the bottom of what actually happened? But I first had to get them to rewrite the story because quite honestly, they were ready to jump to termination. And you've probably seen this with your teams and seen the impact that it has when at the end of the day, you know, the person who everybody loves does something in a chapter meeting and everybody goes, oh, that was weird, but they must be having a bad day. But the person who maybe everybody's a little frustrated with, everybody thinks isn't playing as part of the team, does the exact same thing and everybody's up in arms. Well, the only difference between those two things is whether or not we're telling the story with an assumption of good intent. And the reality is we can only lead with that assumption of good intent when we trust people. So how do we build trust? Building trust first comes from self-reflection. Now, a lot of people go, what? Like, I thought trust was all about what everybody else was doing. In reality, in order for us to build trust with others, we first have to be willing to look in the mirror and say to ourselves, who am I? What matters to me? And how do I view the world? We have to recognize how our preference for certain parts of our styles makes a difference on how we see things. We also have to recognize how we tend to approach things when we're in stressful situations might have impact on others. But we have to first understand our own stuff, and then we have to be willing to share that and be vulnerable with others. And when we do these two things across a team, when we say, look, here's the good, bad, and ugly about me. Here's what I'm great at. Here's the things I struggle with. Here's where I maybe don't show up under stress in the best way. And I'm willing to share that with other people. Well, now I've given them frame of reference for maybe why I do that thing I do that's driving everybody crazy. And when we know that, then it's easier for everybody to lead with an assumption of good intent. And so building trust in teams is all about going through a series of exercises with your teams, not about hugging and saying kumbaya, but instead about giving each individual in the team the opportunity to self-reflect. And then more importantly, giving the team the opportunity to share their vulnerabilities to get to know each other. Because the more we know about people, the more we start to understand and appreciate what they bring to the table. I'm going to share an example that's a Delta Sig example that goes back many, many years. But it was probably one of the best examples I've ever seen of this coming together. We had one of our volunteer leadership teams that was really struggling. They had been through a really hard time. The leader in the team had broken trust across a lot of people. And in the wake of him breaking trust with people, some people were his friends, some were not. So it really tore the team apart. And we were going to a regional event at a conference, and it was going to be the first time that this team was going to be getting back together. And we knew it was going to be tough. There were emails going around that were contentious. There was, they needed to have a new election, and people were butting heads. It was going to be ugly. And the regional manager, actually the interim PPP at the time, called me and said, Katie, can you come in and help? And I was like, I have no idea how I'm going to help in this one. But we talked it out, and he told me some of the backstory as to why this issue was happening. And I said, you know what? We need to just start by building some basic trust before the weekend. And so we flew everybody in the day before the event started. And we started the day, I said, look, guys, I mean, there were people in the room that were just not happy to be there. They did not want to be in the same room with each other, more or less the thought that they were going to try to get along by the end of the day. And I told them, I said, look, guys, give me 8 hours. Give me 8 hours. And if at the end of the day, you still can't see a path forward, then we have a very different conversation. And the exercises that I'm going to take you through now are the exercises that we went through in those 8 hours. And it truly was people doing some self-reflection and then bringing people forward to say, you know what, now share, just give it a shot. And in doing that, it was amazing that by the end of the day, the two folks that came in most adamant that there was no way that this group was going to come together actually ended up being really good friends. And by the end of the day, they looked at each other and they were like, wow, I didn't realize our Delta Sig path had been so close, like so aligned. And in fact, they even found out that they had been at the same Delta Sig event 8 years earlier. And when I asked a question, what was the Delta Sig moment that made you want to be a volunteer leader? They both separately named the exact same event, not knowing it was the same event, until we unpacked sort of where you were and what was going on. And they just looked at each other. They were like, that was me. I was there. And so it's because, again, you start to open your mind when you're building trust, and that makes a big difference. I mentioned that people trust at different rates. This is really like, it sounds so basic, but I will tell you, I have seen people who have been leaders for 40 years. And when I explain this, they look at me like, oh my God, why didn't anybody ever tell me this? Because we really do assume that everybody approaches trust the same way we do. And so one of the exercises that you can do with your team is getting everybody to think about, how do I approach trust? And then sharing this with each other. Because when we approach trust differently and we don't realize it, we can actually really get into some complicated situations, and conflict becomes unhealthy. So here's a couple of one of the exercises I do is have everybody kind of stand on a line, and you can do this on Zoom just using pieces of paper with numbers on it and hold it up. But I ask folks to put themselves on a scale of 1 to 10. How do they trust? And the folks at the 1 end are individuals that lead with trust, and you got to do something really big to break that trust. These are the folks that, like I said, can often be told that they'd be stolen if they weren't careful in life. They just assume first of all, they assume everybody else is well-intended. And in addition to it, they also tend to assume that everybody trusts the same way they do. So they tend to share information really quickly. They tend to jump right in and be like, let's all just work together. Let's just get it done together. Well, if you're somebody on the 10 side of the scale where you really reserve trust for people who have earned it, and it's penny by penny by penny in your piggy bank, you look at that person and go, they must have a hidden agenda. There's something not real about that, because nobody trusts that easily. And so when you get your 1s and your 10s trying to work together without intentionally building trust and talking about how they trust, things break down quickly. Now, in the middle of the road is folks that lead with trust, but that trust can be broken really easily. So I may get there, but boy, doesn't take a lot for you to break my piggy bank. And then it may be hard for you to get that trust back. On the flip side, there are some folks that reserve their trust, but at the same time, it can be hard. Once you get it, you'll get a lot of grace and a lot of leeway. These are the folks that I kind of call the 5 or 6 range. They're sort of halfway in between your far extremes of the continuum. But if you ask each of you members of the team, where do they put themselves on this scale and why? And you simply go around the group and have people answer the information and then share in the conversation so that we're having really good dialogue about this. Again, what it does is it gives you insight. I'll share an example from one of the, I was talking to a mentor of mine, and I had just started mentoring with her. And she was telling me the story about her new boss. And she's like, this lady is crazy and I don't trust her. And I said, okay, tell me why. And she said, well, it was like day 2 of working for her. And she starts telling me how, like, she's not that great of she struggles as a leader. And she starts telling me how she's not that great of a listener. And here's the thing she's not good at. She's like, and there's no way you tell that to anybody. Like, you don't just share that on day 2 of knowing somebody. And I kind of chuckled. And luckily, this individual I was mentoring, I've known for many, many years. In fact, I met her when she was just graduating college. And I just kind of laughed. And she said, okay, Katie, why are you chuckling? And I said, well, Laura, that's what I do with people probably on day 1 of when they join my team. And she's like, why in God's name would you do that? I said, because to be honest, I feel like I know I'm not good at things, and I trust that that will help somebody else. And I said, and I'm not worried about whether or not I can trust the person by saying I'm not great at everything, because I just figure it'll all work out. Never even occurred to me that somebody might think that that was weird. And so during this dialogue, I asked her, I said, so tell me how you trust. And she's like, I said, tell me about your last brand new manager. How long did it take you to really trust that person? And lo and behold, Laura's on the 10 end of the scale. And so in her mind, she would never tell somebody that kind of personal information early on. And so by having this dialogue, I said, you know what, how about you go back and have a conversation with your manager about how you trust and what builds that trust for you and what derails that trust for you. So this exercise can be really, really impactful, and it can be done in a small group or it can be done in a large group. Any of the above work, but it's impactful because it takes us back to a team understanding how to approach this trust. And the reason it's particularly impactful is for those of us who are on the one end of this scale, we often skip building trust and we go straight to conflict. And that's problematic for the folks on the 10 end of the scale, because they're sitting there waiting for, like, I need trust before you can engage in conflict. And if I get there too soon, now you must be abrasive, rude, uncaring. And so it really can be a critical piece to things. A good example before we get into our next exercise, years ago when I was at Progressive, I worked for 15 years at Progressive Insurance, and one of my team members, she was also a 10 on the trust scale, but she was a super lively, personable individual. Like, she's the person you would love to hang out with. And never in a million years would I think she was slow to trust based on the way I saw her interacting with others. Then you have me over here, who is literally like the most gullible person you might ever meet and willing to trust anyone, because I just assume we're rowing in the same direction and we're trying to get to good results. And I assume you're really good at what you do. So of course, we're just all going to go in the right direction. And it was interesting that as peers, I got really frustrated because we would have a conversation in a meeting. We'd come to an agreement about whatever the topic was, and then we would leave the meeting. And I would feel like we had a great, healthy, robust discussion about something, and we all came to agreement. And then she would go to my boss that afternoon and be like, yeah, I know we talked about that in the meeting, but I'm not really on board. And here's 5 reasons I'm not on board. And then the next thing I know, my boss has changed his mind. And I'm like, well, I don't care that you disagreed, but why didn't we just have this conversation in the meeting? And so over and over and over again, I was finding it super frustrating. And as somebody who leads with trust, my assumption about her became that because she wasn't willing to engage in healthy conflict, it eroded my trust with her, because I assumed she must be sabotaging or having a hidden agenda. What I learned as we went through this exercise on trust was actually this was as much my problem as it was hers. Because I was leading with trust, I was jumping to engage in healthy conflict. And she was somebody that was super slow to trust and intimidated by, and terrified of conflict. So every time I jumped to healthy conflict that I thought was a great debate, she was like cowering in the corner. And I was eroding her trust because she felt attacked. So she didn't feel safe enough to say, I disagree with that. So her only option was to go say it after the fact. And it wasn't until we had this conversation that I really realized that I actually, as somebody who is quick to trust, I skip right into conflict, and it causes all sorts of issues. And so now when I work with teams for the first time and I work with somebody, particularly, I ask the question, how do you trust? How do you see yourself on this scale? And what goes into building that so that I can get the right outcomes? I'm going to stop there for just a moment and give folks a chance to ask questions. Feel free, you can either put your questions in the chat. You can also take yourself off of mute. First of all, are there any questions about how this trust exercise works? And have ever any of you done anything similar in terms of trust on your end?
I'm just wondering, you said you ask how people trust and like how you're able to build that with them. Is that something that people are usually like ready to answer, like that they know the answer to easily?
Yeah, it's interesting. I usually approach it one of 2 ways. If I can, I'll tell people we're going to have the conversation beforehand. Or what you can do is, if you're doing this in a group setting and you put the question out there, give everybody a couple of minutes, because you will have some parts of the group that are more introspective, and they're going to want to think about their answers before they just blurt them out. So you can set up the exercise by saying, I want you to think about how you go about trust and how would you describe it to others. Take 2 to 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, write down some thoughts on a piece of paper, and then we're going to go around and give everybody a chance to share. And then you as the leader start, because to be honest, you knew the conversation was coming. And so you being vulnerable first will kind of help open it up. and then give people an opportunity to kind of share as they're ready. But by giving people a few minutes to at least write down their answers before just putting them on the spot and waiting for, being like, okay, now here you go, tell me something important about yourself, it will make a big difference as to, for those folks who like to be introspective first, it'll give them an opportunity to share. I do find though, Denise, most people will share. They might get a little uncomfortable. You kind of have to, just make sure it's a safe place. And sometimes if there's already dysfunction in a team, you might need a third person, maybe your district director or faculty or advisor or something, and talk to them about helping facilitate it so that you don't come off as the person forcing them to. In one-on-one settings, if I know I'm just having this conversation with like a new team member, typically what I'll do is send them that question in advance and say, look, as part of getting to know you, this is something that's really important to me, and I would love to hear your thoughts. And by asking up front, people are usually super excited by a leader who recognizes that everybody doesn't trust the same, and so they're really excited to share.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions on this exercise?
I have a question. Hi, by the way.
Hi, Samantha.
How would you start these conversations, for example, in a chapter meeting or, in a place where usually other types of conversation happens and not just like the sit down, talk about our feelings kind of a thing?
Yeah, that's where, first of all, give people a heads up. So telling folks that, look, we're going to try something a little different this week. And, in an effort to not just get business done, but to really get to know each other, we've got, you can always say, I attended a leadership webinar and they had this idea. That usually goes well, but also getting people moving in this one helps. So if you can be in person and having everybody actually like put the numbers on the wall on a piece of paper and have people line up along where they are, because when I don't just have to state my number, but I see where other people are, it starts a more organic conversation. I had a client where we did this. It was a group of like 7 or 8 people, I think, in the room. And what was funny was they had all worked together for 4 or 5 years, and they were feeling pretty good about their trust in their team. And I had them line up on the continuum in this. And I will never forget, Jennifer was the one, and her boss was like at a 9 or 10. And she was standing down at this end of the row, and she kind of leaned forward and looked at him and was like, I don't even understand how you can see the world that way. And he looked at her and said, I don't understand how you have it. Like, how don't you get robbed every day of the week? So it organically started its own conversation that we then let, then I could pull out conversations around like, so why did you answer the way you did? So even just by making people sort of pick a number and then give them the chance to share why they picked it, there's no right or wrong answer, but you learn a ton about people when they start to share. Great.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Going to jump in and talk about another one of the exercises that I love to do in the trust space is this exercise. This comes straight from Patrick Lencioni's book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And I've got to tell you, every time I go to do this with a team, I get nervous because I'm like, oh, somebody's going to think this is super hokey. And yet every time I do it, I walk away and people are like, that was really great. In fact, the team that I was talking about a couple of weeks ago, we did this exercise, group of people who had worked together for 15, 20 years, all men, all have been in leadership for a really long time. And I start with our exercise on trust today, and you could feel the eyes starting to roll. But what I asked them to share was, first of all, where did you grow up? How many siblings do you have? And where do you fall in the age group? What was an important challenge of your childhood that sort of impacts who you are today? And then this last one I have added, and particularly for Delta Sig teams, I think this is an easy one for people to talk about, but it gets you to be a little bit more vulnerable, is what was the moment you knew you wanted to be a Delta Sig? What these questions do, while on the surface, they seem super basic, what they do is each one starts to get a little deeper in vulnerability. So where did I grow up? Pretty easy. But most of us don't just give us name in a city. We talk a little bit about it. We start to share a little bit. how many siblings do I have and where do I fall in the age group? Well, here I start to tell a little bit more, because typically you start to have folks, for example, if I think back to that really tough Delta Sig situation, this was one of the starting points that these two gentlemen started to really connect, because what they didn't know was they both had been raised by their grandmothers. And so while they had wildly different backgrounds and experiences, had grown up in different states, had everything else about the way these two people had seen the world was different. But the first gentleman said, he said, how many siblings do you have and where do you fall in the age group? And he said, I'm an only child and I was raised by my grandmother, and that creates a different outlook and dynamic for me. And I was sitting in this room, again, of folks that were still at about 9 o'clock in the morning. So they weren't still real happy to be there. And the other guy just kind of looked at me, he goes, seriously? And I was like, well, that's a crack in the armor. This could get good. And he's like, I was raised by my grandmother. I'm an only child. He's like, isn't it weird how? And they started just talking about this shared experience. So again, it's not about, these aren't earth-shattering, make people cry conversations, but the more we know about each other, the easier it is to lead with this assumption of good intent. So these idea of these trust exercises aren't fall off the table and let me see if I catch you, or let me hug you and cry and sing kumbaya. It's let me get to know you. And where we are in our sibling world is a big deal. I have friends that have known me for 25 years and they have no idea. They maybe know I have a sister, but most of my friends think I'm the older sister. I'm actually the younger by about 3 years. And the dynamic between my sister and I is really kind of funky. So, there's more to each of us that we often don't know. The what was an important challenge of your childhood goes one level a little bit deeper. Again, it gets to that vulnerability. Being willing to share, you don't need to share your deepest, darkest secret about your childhood, but I always encourage folks, share what you're comfortable with, but put yourself out there a little bit. Give somebody something that, helps you know about the other person and gets people to start to learn more about you. And then what was the moment you knew you wanted to be a Delta Sig? In this world, we all have this common bond, right? Like we all made this absolutely voluntary decision to join this organization. And when we really peel back the onion, there's some reason for each of us that's very personal. At the same time, when we know those personal pieces, we start to understand that there's a lot of mutual interest and commonality in that. And when we start to find those things that we have in common with each other, it allows us to accept each other's differences in a very different way. And that's what trust is all about. It's not about leaving our differences behind, but it's about also finding things that we have in common so that we can connect, so that then we can also bring value and understand the value of those interests. The next exercise that I suggest teams do is, and again, these can be broken out. These can be little 5-minute things at different meetings. They don't have to take your entire meeting. But talk about what are the behaviors that build trust and what are the behaviors that derail trust. Now, this one seems super basic and everybody's like, oh, don't we all have the same things? What you will learn in this exercise is that for some people, certain things are triggers that derail trust that are things that you and I would never dream of. For example, I'll use my sister and I as a perfect example. Interrupting is one of my sister's biggest derailers of trust. And I am the queen of interruptions. Especially if I agree with you. The more I agree with you, the more likely I am to interrupt you. So to me, I'm building trust. For her, it is destroying her trust. And so having these conversations in small groups, you can also do this. I do this with my new hires, one-to-one. Tell me what builds trust for you. Tell me what's going to derail it, because it keeps me from stepping on those landmines that are really problematic. But it can be as easy as take a flip chart behind you, put a line down the middle and have people start these lists and then have the team start to talk about them. Or if you're working with just trying to build trust with one person that maybe you're struggling with, same concept. Both of us come with our lists and now let's share them. It's in the shared conversations that we usually find, again, commonalities, but also places where our differences may be causing us unnecessary stress. Before I go to the next exercise, I want to stop there again quickly. Are there questions or comments about either of those exercises, questions that I can answer for you about how do you actually take that back and apply it with your team? All right, I'm going to assume folks are good. I always give people plenty of time on Zoom because you got to find your mute button and all of that. If you do have a question, don't hesitate to throw it in the chat. Again, this is another good one. Each of these exercises, I've done them sometimes as retreats where like we do like an exec committee retreat and we go through all of these together and it's a whole day of this, or 4 hours for a team, things like that. Other times, if I just know like, let's do one of these in each of our upcoming meetings. So you're building the trust over time. But every time somebody new joins the team, it's another good discussion. So you can keep enhancing and developing the trust across groups. The next exercise is kind of a builder on this willingness to be vulnerable. So in this one, you ask folks to think about what are areas of leadership that you feel are your strengths, and not just your strengths in terms of like, yeah, I'm kind of good at that, but what are the areas where you feel like you could be a mentor for somebody? And on the flip side, what are the areas of leadership where you would like for somebody to mentor you? And if you go around the group and everybody shares this, one, it gives you the opportunity. I guarantee you, sooner or later, people in the room are like, ooh, this thing that I feel like I could mentor someone else on is something someone else would like mentoring in. And now you start to find, where do we feel like individuals in the organization can help, even if it just informally, mentor in specific areas. So we don't all have to be just an individual mentor to one person from beginning to end. In addition, what this does is, remember back to the slide I showed where it was about self-reflection and sharing vulnerabilities. The self-reflection piece in this case has to happen first. So this is a great one, Denise, to your question of like, do people actually answer this? This is a great one to ask people in advance. And more importantly, when you really, if you're doing this with a team that really has trust already, not only can you have people share their own personal thoughts around where do they have strengths that could be mentors and where could they use a mentor. The flip side to this is, if you get a team with high levels of trust, you can actually have each team member share what are things about the other person that I view as strengths, that where I think that person should be a mentor to others, and what are areas that I think maybe they could use development in. I had a client who we have gone through probably almost a year and a half of working together on various areas of these 5 dysfunctions. And a lot of it has been around trust, because we just about get it done and then they would reorg the structure and we had to just kind of start again. We finally, this time around, got to the point, we went in all the way around the room and everybody had to tell every other person in the room one strength that they thought that other individual brought to the team. And you had to say it in front of everyone, and it had to be meaningful. So it couldn't be, you're a really friendly guy or you make good coffee. It had to be meaningful and impactful. What do you think this person's greatest strength is for the team? Then, and in this case, I had them do the second part of this as one-on-one conversations. But one-on-one, it was, if you were going to share with this person one area that you think that they could use some development on over the next year, where would you have them focus their attention? And it takes a lot of trust to, one, be willing to share that, because you're telling somebody is something that's not a strength, and you've got to be willing that that person's not going to flip out. And on the flip side, taking it in, you trusted almost every single person, when I asked them what was their experience in receiving it, said, you know what? It was great to hear that the things I thought were my areas of development are what other people see, but it was even better to know I don't have to keep trying to act like I'm good at something I'm not, because we all know what my area of opportunity is. Now these people can help me be a part of getting better at it. And so this conversation can be really, really impactful, especially if you're talking about an exec team that's trying to work together. Getting to this point in your roles and when you've got this level of trust is really, really key. So we've covered a ton of territory. These are just some of the ideas that come out of how do you go about building trust to build a strong team. There are a couple of different resources that I want to make sure. First of all, I will share, Chelsea, I will make these slides available to you so you can help make them available to the folks on the call. And I'm more than happy to make sure we get this to people. All of you are more than happy to, or more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. And I'm happy to have a conversation there or connect for networking outside of that. I do a ton of that in the Delta Sig space. Couple of the resources that I've referenced through this that I think are really big. 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. If you haven't read it, like go out and get it. It's an easy read. It's a quick read. It's fantastic. If you're somebody that wants to know the content, but you hate books that are written like fables or stories, which I will tell you, some people, that's what they don't like about 5 Dysfunctions. He wrote the exact same content in a much more matter of fact, here's the information you need to know, no story, no fable way, in the book called The Advantage. He truly took the exact same content and made a fortune on 2 separate books. It was quite brilliant, actually. But for different styles, those 2 books can work based on how the types of things you prefer to read. The third piece is understanding your own personal style. Where I talk about self-reflection, one of the key pieces in self-reflection is understanding your own personal style, which means whether it be DISC assessment or Myers-Briggs or Strength Finders, any of these types of tools. I am a huge fan of DISC because it is easy. It's easy for people to understand. It gives you really good information to be able to share with others. But taking teams through, we do this with clients all the time. We take intact teams through DISC and have them share their styles together is an amazing way for people to start to rewrite stories that are happening with an assumption of good intent, because most of what happens in communication in teams comes down to we just approach things from slightly different ways, but we get to the end result. We can get to the same end result. We just have to value what everybody brings to the team. I'm going to stop there. That was a ton of information. So I hope everybody got a lot out of that, but I do want to give you some time. If any of you have questions or comments or have tried any of this and want to share your experiences, I would love to know more, but I will open it up for questions and conversation at this point. Great. Ryan, I think I see a hand there for Ryan.
So you mentioned that one exercise where you, I'm sorry, where it's like what behaviors build trust and what behaviors hurt trust.
Yeah.
How do you make sure with that second category you aren't like accidentally attacking someone?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the ways that I've done this is break people out into smaller groups. And so I'll put people in small groups of maybe 3 or 4, maybe up to 5 people in their little group, and then have every one of the smaller groups debrief on their list. That way people start to see that there will be differences in each of the lists, but there also will be commonalities. But because they all came out of the small groups discussions, it takes away some of the personal edge to things. So, and if you have a small group to start, you can even just partner people up and do it in small groups of 2. But then when the reporting out starts to happen, it takes away some of that weirdness that can be like, oh, were you saying that because of me? Or like, it just takes away some of that weirdness. So small groups can work. If you're on Zoom, I know folks, some schools are still totally virtual. If you use the version of Zoom that has breakout rooms, I'll put people into breakout rooms and have them chat and then bring them back and have them share as a group. And that way it tends to, if there are 2 or 3 people who maybe aren't trusting each other, the fact that they came out of small group discussions seems to take the sting out of things. Great question, Ryan. Other questions from the group? Samantha.
So in an environment where, of course, like most of our meetings currently as students where none of us really have, I guess, power over people. Like, yes, like you can be an executive member of any sort or just a leader in this case, but how do you get people to like, all right, like follow, I guess, the rules or follow the instructions when they basically see you as an equal?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is. I will tell you, it's probably one of the biggest challenges, but it's also one of the biggest benefits of joining Delta Sig. Because Delta Sig gives you the opportunity to practice in your collegiate life how to lead when nobody's given you a job title. And it is leading when you don't have the title to go with it is the hardest thing you will ever do. It takes absolute skill. The good news is you get to practice it as a collegiate and you get to learn from it. One of the things you can do in stepping into this space, even in this particular exercise, you know, if the president of the team of the organization walks in and says, we're going to do this, well, everybody does it because the president said so. But how cool is it if instead you come forward and say, hey, you know what? I learned something. I learned a concept in leadership that I think we could all value from. Let's give this a try and see not only what it does for the team, but then make it about their learning. Because, right, we all join Delta Sig because we want to learn outside of the classroom. So in addition to the what did it do for your team, debrief at the end of it of, so how would we each use this in our real world? Like when we get our first job, how might we use this? When we get our first boss, how might I use this? As leaders in Delta Sig space, the more we can be bringing ideas to each other and know that some of them are going to flop, right? We're going to do things that you go, oh God, that did not work. But if you do it in the spirit of, I'm trying to learn, not I'm trying to tell you all you need to be fixed. And I think that's the really big thing is in leadership, really good coaches and leaders develop people, they don't fix people. And so this concept of building trust is, I want to know about you because I really want to understand you. And I want to be able to adapt to you and coach to you and be there to support you, not I'm going to try to make you be something you aren't. And so when we trust people and we're all growing in that way, it makes a big difference. But I think from a leadership perspective, learning to build trust is the key to helping influence people when you don't necessarily have the title to tell them what to do. Because people only follow, honestly, they might do what somebody says because they have a job title, but they won't really follow or be influenced by that person. And so your job is to figure out how do you build trust so people will follow you because they believe you will lead them down the right path.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions tonight? Great, I've got a couple here. Angela.
Hi. So I just wanted to ask, like, well, first of all, thank you so much for presenting. I appreciate it. Oh, in the terms of like in a management perspective, like what are some ways to help integrate a new employee that might be shy or like doesn't feel comfortable into like integrating with the team? And maybe what can we do if like the team is very click oriented, like they're very close, right? And it's kind of hard for them to integrate themselves in.
Yeah, that can be really tough. One of the things I use is one-on-ones when I'm integrating a new team member. So in addition to one-on-ones with me, I actually ask every time I bring on a new hire, I ask each member of my team to spend time one-on-one with the other members of the team. And I give them questions like the ones I shared here in the trust exercises. In my case, I have them take all my team members take DISC assessments. And so they have everybody has their current DISC assessment. The new hire gets theirs. And one of the things that they're supposed to talk about in their one-on-one is what were their big takeaways from the what are the big takeaways and what are things that they feel are valuable for other people to know about how they like to approach work and what's really important to them. And it's usually in those conversations that people will not just share the information that's in the profile, but they'll start to share stories and examples, and that helps build the bond. And that really makes a huge difference. So, and I'm not part of those meetings, and that's very intentional because I make sure they happen, but the real trust and the real connection between people happens when I'm not in the room. And so I try to make sure that they have opportunities early on in their onboarding to make those connections with people and make them somewhat informal. Give them a general structure, but like, hey, I'd like to make sure you have a cup of coffee with everybody in the team. And that can be virtually, that works really well too. But make it about getting to know each other, not about here's the things on the checklist I need to teach you. Does that help, Angela?
Yes, that does. Thank you so much.
Sure. I believe it's Jesus.
Yes.
Great.
So my question is, I know you talked a lot about like multiple ways to resolve like internal conflicts, but what is your favorite and like, well, your most favorite way of solving conflicts within an organization like DSP?
Yeah, I've had a lot of those. I've had some tough ones too. So there's a lot of different ways. I will tell you my favorite way is, it's weird that it's favorite because some of my best experiences have come from teams that were starting from a really negative place. But if you can help a team inch closer and closer to building trust, watching it unfold is so amazing. And it will just sort of dumbfound you. So one of the things that I think is most important again is this: how do you get people to rewrite the stories that are in their head about this assumption of good intent? And sometimes what I've done, Jesus, is literally tell folks when there's conflict going on and everybody is like, why did you and why did you? Is I will literally force people to take out a pen and a piece of paper and rewrite the story, write the scenario in a way that absolutely only leads with good intent. And I will force people to do it. And then they even can do it with a peer where you're like, nope, rewrite it because you still had some negative intent in there. And people will start to laugh at themselves because they realize just how much of their own drama they're bringing to the table through the scenario. And when you can do that, it makes a huge difference in terms of how people see things. So those are just some of the exercises that you can really, again, get people to retell the story and reframe it. And now they can start to recognize that there's at least a possibility that there's a different version out there. And sometimes that includes like telling, there are some scenarios that I've done where it's like you play out a story. Either, you whether you have people act it out or you're all in a setting, and then you ask people to go around and describe what they just saw happen. And just in that, you will start to see how differently people see the world and how they attribute their thoughts and their perspectives. And so just getting people to be more aware of what's going on around them can help undo a lot of conflict much of the time. Great. Thanks, Jesus. Wonderful. Well, I want to be super conscious of everyone's time. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to learn more about leadership and about trust. Please absolutely connect with me on LinkedIn.